Okay, welcome. Today we've got a district plan review briefing, 8th of February today. And to introduce this, I will ask Michael Day and Catherine Overwater to present this item. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship, and good morning, elected members. As Catherine puts the presentation up, I'll kick things off for the day. So firstly, I'll take the covering report as read. We have a PowerPoint presentation which we'll work through and speak to the presentation at times as well. Like the Mayor said, there's a lot of material to try and get through today. It's a very busy day, very important day, but we'll get the work done. Go next slide, please, Catherine. Okay, so briefly what we're covering this morning is an update of where we're at with the project, talk about the strategic direction chapter of the draft district plan, and talk about the national policy statement on urban development and whether Kaipara should be considered an urban environment. Go next slide, please, Catherine. Right. We as staff are after high-level direction from elected members on these key topics today. But importantly, what we'd love for is if we can come to any agreement or consensus with regards to policies, rules, or direction in general, let's try and lock it away. Let's try and move on, because as you'll see shortly, in the next couple of slides, there is a lot of material for us to get through in the next few months. So the more we can agree on earlier, please, Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. So as I've touched on in the covering report, the project is on track for public notification in the middle of this year. With regards to our current budget, review for this, the budget for this financial year is approximately $700,000. That includes all legal, planning and technical expertise. So we need to discuss the modified plan for the middle of this year. Any questions at this stage before I move on? Let's talk about, next slide please, Catherine. Right. I'd like to talk briefly about what we've got in front of us in the next few months. And as I mentioned, today is really the start of the work ramping up. If you look ahead to the next month, March, there's a whole lot more topics which are going to look to cover off through March, April and May. I'd just like to mention though, the main reason why we're talking to you today about zoning and about subdivision is, in my eyes, it's the most important topics in the whole district plan review. It's topics which can enable to give the most growth for the district, and actually it's #1 topic. And so I want us to have several opportunities to actually come to a place where we can all agree on. So that's why I want to bring it to us early, in case we need more time to talk about this topic in particular. Okay. And next slide, Catherine. So there's just the plan to get through all the work by the middle of this year and hopefully notify the plan by the middle of this year, which will be amazing for Kaipara. Right, if no one's got any questions about this, let's crack into the actual workshop briefing.
All right, good morning, Your Worship and elected members. I'll just introduce myself again because it's been since November. So I'm Catherine Overwater, the District Planning Team Leader. And today here with us is Neil Taylor, who's joining us online. Neil's been doing some work for us in the background looking at the feedback received on the strategic direction chapter. So we're just going to do a bit of a tag team to talk through the strategic direction chapter. And as Mike said, the reason we're bringing this chapter to you today as well in conjunction with subdivision zoning is the strategic direction chapter actually sets the framework for the entire district plan. So if you imagine like an umbrella, the strategic direction sits at the top, those are your overarching objectives, and then below that we have our zones and we have specific objectives and policies that relate to those zones. The only one which we'll talk a little bit about today that's a little bit different is the urban form development, which has policies. So most of the time we're just talking about high level objectives. Right, so I'll just crack to the next slide. Sorry, my computer mouse is not. There we go, right. So we've provided you the draft strategic direction chapter that we'd drafted for the draft plan, which went out in August last year. So you've got that as attachment B in the package. And as I said, this provides the overarching direction for sustainable management growth, land use and development for the Kaipara district. And as I said, it is high level, so it's objectives. There are no rules in the strategic direction chapter. And all other provisions in the plan should be consistent with these objectives. But just bear in mind that there's no hierarchy with the strategic objectives amongst themselves either. So no objective in the strategic direction chapter is more important than another. The matters that are addressed in this chapter should be strategically important for the district and for achieving integrated management. And the only mandatory matter is the urban form and development chapter. So this is the one that does have some policies. The others are optional and at the discretion of individual councils. So what we came up with for the draft was obviously the vision and ambition of the previous council. And so today Neil's going to talk through in just a sec the feedback that we've received on those draft provisions and just give you a bit of a flavour of the themes that we received. We have not yet drafted a full package of new strategic direction because we wanted to bring the conversation to you today. And I think one of the important parts that contributes is the discussion we'll have a bit later today about the MPS urban development. So talking about whether Kaipara is urban or not, because that might influence what we actually put in the strategic direction chapter. So just bear that in mind as we work through that today as well. So I'm going to hand over to Neil. Neil, you're all good to go live there? And I'll just bring up the next slide and you can talk your way through the feedback if you like.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me all right.
Loud and clear, Neil.
Okay. Now, there was 96 people gave feedback on the strategic directions chapter. Now that's summarised in attachment C, which has been circulated for today. That runs to 10 pages, so I'm not proposing to go through line by line. What I've got, if everyone's happy, what I've got in mind is to highlight what I think are probably the most important changes that are being suggested coming out of the responses to that feedback. So just a comment, there's 7 topics, as Catherine said, in the strategic directions chapter. Now, all of that material is, all of those topics are returned to later in the plan. So the fine detail on all of them, for example, there's chapters on historic heritage and natural hazards and natural environment, infrastructure, various other topics are dealt with in zone chapters. That's where all the detail resides. So the strategic direction chapter is really just trying to give a very broad direction, as the name suggests, to future development. A lot of the feedback was directed at adding a lot of detail in, and I've not really supported that because I think that detail belongs actually in those specific chapters, the natural hazards chapter or the infrastructure chapter, or wherever the case may be. So what I have done though is where there's been some important new ideas come out of the feedback, I have tried to pick those up. And also, perhaps as Catherine's mentioned, we're likely to have to come back to a few of these in the future as councillors go through the various chapters. We will have to probably just loop back into strategic direction just to make sure that we're being consistent with the messaging across the whole plan. So the points that I thought were the important ones.
Can I interrupt you there, Neil? I just got a question from a councillor, Councillor Lambeth.
Yeah, Neil, we're continually referring to this attachment C, and you said it's available.
And A, B, and C.
And your
Don't know.
agenda. If you do it by item, because there's two
Okay, thank you.
emails from Alana.
Do you want me to help you?
Oh, right.
A hand?
Okay, thank you, Neil. Carry on. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So the so I was just going to go through the main points that I thought really need to be perhaps the major focus today. At the end, I'd be perfectly happy to take questions around anything else that may be that possibly I haven't mentioned. The first heading within the strategic direction chapter that contains objectives is the climate change section. Now, this drew some feedback from 8 people. There was one person who said, don't do anything, but all the rest were really saying do more in various ways than was originally proposed. There is one really important new thing that's come out there, and that is the government last year released a couple of plans related to climate change, and these are called the National Adaptation Plan and the Emissions Reduction Plan. And the legislation around those requires that district councils have to take into account those plans when they're making their district plans. So there's no specific detail as to anything in particular that the council needs to pick up, but it does need to, the council needs to give consideration to those points. Now, it seems to me that the proper home, if we're going to pick up something from those plans, would be in the strategic direction chapter. And there's 3 points. First of all, so there's 2 government plans. The first one, the National Adaptation Plan, that has 3 sort of major goals in it, and that's to reduce vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, enhance adaptive capacity, and strengthen resilience. So it seems to me that those are all pretty simple ideas which could be incorporated into the strategic direction chapter and would fit in pretty much with the material that was already there. The second government plan is called the Emissions Reduction Plan, and that is all about the level of greenhouse gases and things. Now, that's mainly government stuff. The district council's only got very limited, I think, scope to do much around that. But one thing that could be done in the district plan context is, and this is already adverted to in the section, is the idea of a compact urban form and thinking about things like cycle paths, pedestrian walkthroughs, just generally, I suppose, supporting the idea of some of those less car-intensive modes of transport. So those sorts of things. It's probably not a big contribution to emissions reduction, but it is something that the district plan can do. So those are my suggestions there. Now, Your Worship, would you like to pause there and talk about those things, or would it be better for me to just press on with the next point?
I think we've got a lot to go for. We'll press on, I think, Neil.
Okay, thank you. So the second point that I just wanted to raise is the growth section. So this is the next section in the chapter. There's already material there which is about protecting the productive rural land resource, and that's been bolstered again by government action. Just late last year, the government released the National Policy Statement on Highly Productive Land. Now, the objective of that is that highly productive land is protected for use in land-based primary production now and for future generations. That's pretty much the ideas that are already in the growth chapter, but we just need to adjust the terminology, I think, probably more than anything. And my feeling would be that we could pick up essentially the wording from that NPS objective there, just to so that we're aligned with the national policy statement there. So that's that. The other just minor point, this is quite a minor point about the growth section of the chapter, is that although it's headed growth, it's actually not much about growth. There was various people put in saying that there wasn't growth, or it was in the wrong place or something, but really it's not dealing with growth. And my proposal is to just, there's one objective that mentions, that actually even uses the word growth. So my feeling would be to rename that as the vision for Kaipara. The next point, the natural environment section. Once again, it's a national policy statement. This is the one on fresh water management. This requires district plans to manage the effects of urban development on health and well-being of water bodies. So this is something that the chapter as drafted earlier doesn't actually mention, and I think does need to be brought in order to give effect and to recognise the national policy statement on freshwater. So this is just a matter of just adding in a few words in the natural environment section, just along those same lines of acknowledging the health and well-being of water bodies and freshwater ecosystems. So relatively small additional wording required there. The next section is natural hazards. There's only one draft objective there, and that as published previously, and that was to minimise the impacts of natural hazards. That seems a bit vague to me, and it seemed to me, in the light of the feedback, that we perhaps could tighten that up a bit. And the key point, I think, about natural...
Excuse me, Neil, can I interrupt you? I just got a question. Councillor Vincent up there on the screen. Sorry about that.
Okay, sure.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, Neil, I appreciate the job you're doing here. I just want some clarification. First, it seems you might have skipped past the chapter on historical heritage. But I'm just wondering, like, you've made suggestions from national policy statements. I mean, how much of this is your ideas as opposed to suggestions that have come forward in the feedback from the 96 organisations and individuals?
Oh, okay. It's all adverted to somewhere in the feedback.
Okay.
And it is true to say that there were, so for example, the one about the high productive land, a number of people asked for that to be strengthened. Because the national policy statement has only just recently come out, I have added that into the mix. It's the same idea, and I think the national policy statement is coming from the same direction, but it was very definitely a matter of feedback to strengthen that philosophy around protecting the rural productive resource.
Thank you.
Okay. Now we're still on natural hazards. Drought is within the RMA definition of natural hazard, but it's not actually mentioned in this section specifically. The Northland Regional Council in its feedback said that it ought to be referred to as a natural hazard likely to happen in Kaipara. The regional council said that there has been examples of drought on a fairly regular basis, and I must say I haven't got the stats on that, but no doubt councils will be well aware of past examples of droughts. And the important implication of drought is not that we can do anything about it, of course, to stop it in the district plan, but the response might be related to sustainable water supplies. And it could be that this, at the high level, we simply advert to the need for sustainable water supplies for residential development, wherever that might be. Sorry, Councillor, about the heritage, I didn't answer that question. There was no feedback at all on historic heritage, so everyone seems to be happy with that. So I've not made any changes. Moving on then to the section called Tangata Whenua and Mana Whenua. There was not much feedback here, but we did hear from Te Uru Oho and Te Roroa, who made a joint feedback. They had a couple of things to say about tidying up some of the wording, and in particular, they mentioned the use of the Te Reo words, Mana Whenua and Tangata Whenua, and they suggested that there was some perhaps misunderstanding of just how those words should be used. Now, I'm not an expert on Te Reo by any means. My suggestion there is that, and I haven't made any firm suggestions as to changing that, what I suggest we do, and what staff can do on behalf of council, is to engage a little bit more with the iwi around that wording and just what they see as the experts in this area, and to just get that right. It's important that it's right, and I think that would be my suggestion there. The final section that I just want to mention, this is the final point I want to talk about, is the urban form and development. This is the last section of this chapter. Now, quite a bit of that, what goes in there's quite a bit of feedback around that, and I have suggested a few changes here and there, but a lot of it turns on the question of the national policy statement on urban development. Now, that's the very next section this morning that elected members are going to talk about. So I suggest that we don't perhaps get into that too much just now, but perhaps wait for that wider discussion and the presentation around that. So that's all my points, Your Worship, but I'm perfectly happy to discuss and answer any further questions in the remaining time. Thank you.
Okay, Neil, thank you. I have a question from Gordon Lamb.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I skimmed over reverse sensitivity. Any reason for that, or is it of non-importance, or?
It's, yes, no, thank you. I did the main feedback there was, well, two things. That there wasn't much about it from the public. One person said ditch it, and one person said move it into the growth section, which I'm suggesting perhaps could be renamed vision. I don't think that it makes a lot of difference where it's homed, and it might be that just sort of tidies up not to have a separate section. Reverse sensitivity is not very well explained, I think, in the preamble to that section, and that should really be tidied up. I think perhaps I can just say a word about reverse sensitivity. The classic example of it, and one that I know about in the Waikato where I am, is an existing pig farm had subdivisions for lifestyle blocks happen all around it. And then the people who moved on to the lifestyle blocks started to complain about the smell from the pigs. And they succeeded with agitation and complaints and a big campaign to actually getting the pig farm closed down. So that's reverse sensitivity at work. It's not the scenario is that there's a sensitive activity moving into something that's in place and can't really contain its effects fully. Airports are another classic example of that, where houses move in beside an airport, and there's been examples overseas of airports actually having to close because there's so many complaints from people about the noise. So that's reverse sensitivity at work, it's very common for district plans to say things to try and stop sensitive activities going in near existing incompatible activities. So this plan is no different. The Northland Regional Policy Statement, which we have to give effect to, says that district plans ought to actually say that reverse sensitivity situations should be avoided. At the moment, we're just talking about mitigating them. So it might be some scope there for strengthening that.
So just as a supplementary to that, do you feel that if somebody is moving to the country, to a rural site, is it appropriate that you complain about rural activities around them?
Well, I think, I think we might all agree that it would be, the sort of somehow unfair for people to move in and then start complaining. But unfortunately, that's the, I guess, human nature, is that does actually happen. And so the district plan, I suppose, is just trying to deal with that. In terms of rural stuff, apart from like intensive pig farms or quarries or specific activities like that that are especially noisy or smelly or what have you, just general spray drift is another one that causes that does cause some complaints quite often. But just general rural like dairy farms and things don't generate a lot of complaints generally.
Because this could become a tool to close opposition businesses down, could it not? And I'm very, very touchy about that. If we're going to condone this sort of behaviour by businesses to do this, allowing them a tool to use this. The reverse sensitivity, does it apply to the owner, or can it apply to a occupier of the premises?
It just applies to, it's generally applied actually at the time of a resource consent or a subdivision proposal, which is proposing to bring a sensitive activity near an existing noisy or smelly or what have you, existing activity. So it's trying to keep the sensitive activity away, the residential or what have you, away from where it is. So it's not penalising, in fact, it's trying to protect the existing industry or pig farm or whatever it is that's already in place.
Councillor Howard.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Neil, you've just clarified in your last sentence here where I was really coming from. I mean, I would have thought that reverse sensitivities policy for us should protect existing businesses, entities that are lawfully operating and take account. You talk about the growth factor, take account of growth where we're giving ability for, say, residential to expand to. So I think it's very much about protecting what's there. You know, it's a horrible situation when you go back to that example you talked about in the Waikato. People knew what was there.
Yeah, yes, that's certainly my view.
Neil, can those rights of the existing operator, say the pig farmer, be protected by consent notices on the subdivision nearby when that subdivision is established?
Yes, so there are some techniques which can be employed like that. Probably the best strategy is for people not to get too close in the first place, who are, you know, a sensitive activity, and that would be, I think, the thrust of the district plan would be to keep those incompatible activities apart.
Thank you. Any further questions, councillors? Thank you, Neil. Is that your conclusion, or have you?
Yes, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Vincent.
Oh, was there a hand up?
I was just waving an acknowledgement to Neil, that was all.
All right. Thank you, Neil. So I'm going to now jump into the national policy statement discussion. If you're ready, Your Worship.
Yep.
Now, should be some additional staff on board there. We've got our economists joining us today from Formative. So they prepared the memorandum that we presented as an attachment to this item as well. I think it's attachment D, I think. Is that correct? Yes. Yep. So you've hopefully had a little look at that. So I'm just going to step you through this discussion, which for previous councillors, you will have heard this before. But I guess the intention is that we really need to come to some kind of conclusion about whether Kaipara is an urban environment or not. And the reason that's important for our district plan review is because as we move forward, we will be challenged on this. We've already got people raising in the feedback that council should be deemed an urban environment and therefore the NPS-UD applies. So I'm going to step you through all of the nuts and bolts of that. And what we're planning to do is actually get some consensus today, hopefully, and then bring a paper to the March Council meeting. Would that be fair to say, Michael? And get a decision made on it, just so that we've got something, you know, concrete in this space, just so we can come back to it if we have to be challenged in the future on this issue. So where does this start? So the National Policy Statement on Urban Development came about a few years ago now. And Kaipara's been a little bit slow in terms of deciding whether an urban environment or not. And one of the cases that it did become an issue for was Private Plan Change 78 here in Mangawhai, where the commissioners who were determining a decision on that did deem that Mangawhai could be or would be an urban environment because they felt that it met both clauses A and B of this definition, which I've got on the screen there, from the legislation or the national policy statement. So just quickly on that, so part A of that definition is that the area of land is or is intended to be predominantly urban in character, and B is or is intended to be part of a housing and labour market of at least 10,000 people. So we've got to kind of tick those boxes to say that we are an urban environment, and if we decide today that we're not, then that's okay too. I'll explain what that means. So Formative did a little bit of work for us in the background to take this issue further, because we weren't quite convinced that the decision from Plan Change 78 was a conclusive answer for the entire Kaipara district. It did really just deal with Mangawhai. So Formative's conclusion did say that we are projected to reach a population of 10,000 by 2034, which is the life of this district plan review. But if you've read the paper, it's very, very much just getting in there, and it's mostly based on Mangawhai being the high growth area. Dargaville is not so much. So we had a big discussion with lawyers about where do we go with this. We're kind of scraping in there. Their view was that we could argue both ways, which didn't help us much. And then there's a big discussion about whether Kaipara is predominantly urban in character, which most of you will know that some of our towns are certainly not urban in character at this stage when you compare it to some of the other councils and what they're doing in this space. We took guidance from our previous council to talk to the Ministry for the Environment, who were, I'll say, not that helpful. Their advice to us was that they would like us to implement the NPSUD, and they would like councils to start thinking in the way that we would become urban environments in the future. But they did say to us that it is at the discretion of our councils to decide. And obviously that's why we're here today, because we don't feel like we've kind of landed on that. So yeah, what the NPS means for us as council, there are some requirements already for us as a district council, whether we're an urban environment or not, but there are some really key things moving forward if we are an urban environment. So I just wanted to sort of explain the policies there. And you'll see in the presentation, I won't go line by line because I will just take it as read, but we've got policy 2, which talks to tier 3 local authorities, and policy 5 is probably a key one because it talks about transportation networks and obviously our demand for housing business in that location. So there are some quite key requirements for us to tick that box. And then policy 6, which is about, making planning decisions that affect urban environments. And then I've made a mention of policies 8, 9, 10, 11 also. And I think probably the key one for the district plan is policy 11. If we do decide that we are going to be an urban environment, there's a requirement that councils take the car parking requirements out of the district plan, which means then developers would not have to meet those requirements. So some see that as a real benefit, and others.
Catherine, to the chair, that would also mean that council would be obliged to amend its operative.
That's correct. Yeah.
Straight away to take out the car parking requirements as well.
Yes.
So it's not just our proposed plan, but our operative plan as well.
Yeah, good point there, Michael. Thank you. Yeah, so I think in a district where we largely don't have public transport, that is something that you guys might want to think about today at the table. And obviously going forward, council would need to find a way in which to find car parking to offset those car parks being removed from development.
Through the Mayor, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just on this car parking, are we talking mainly domestic, or we're talking, parking for commercial businesses, the whole gambit?
Everything.
Everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we have examples of councils that have gone through this policy 11 and taken out?
So it would be fair to say that a lot of councils have removed that requirement, especially urban. If you've just deemed an urban environment, they have to. So we can't really compare ourselves with in Auckland or Whangarei because they have public transport. So we have looked at what other rural councils are doing. I came up the road from the Waikato district, and they were in the decision making as to whether to pull those or not. And that did have some consequences for some of the rural towns. We've looked at what's happening at some of the small Coromandel coastal communities that were similar to Mangawhai. Far North did make a call based on Kerikeri that they were going to take their car parking requirements out of their plan as well. So, yeah, so there aren't many councils left with car parking requirements in their plan, if that's helpful.
And so if I may, one last question. So we can do, if we want to apply this to a specific area within the overall district, or does it have to apply to the total district?
It would have to apply to the whole district, and that's what we're deciding, the conversation needs to be today, whether the whole of Kaipara is deemed an urban environment or not. And I know that's really tricky because we've got very different towns and settlements throughout.
But you just mentioned Kerikeri specifically.
Oh,
In Far North.
Kerikeri is the Far North high growth area, probably similar to what's happening in Mangawhai. So a lot of their basis was around the growth that's happening there. So that they used the projections for population, etc., based on Kerikeri to deem the whole of Far North an urban environment, if that makes sense.
Councillor Lambeth.
Yeah, through the Mayor. It is a statutory requirement or it is a requirement for building consent to have car parking now in urban areas. Just because we don't make it a rule for a consent doesn't mean to say that that's taken out. A higher quality home will have its car parking. A lower quality unit will not. I'm just trying to, in what you've seen happen around the country, if this rule is taken out, do the sheep so follow, or do people, when they do their planning, plan car parks as a high quality home? You understand what I'm...
Yeah, the district plan, if there's nothing in the district plan, they could still propose car parking, but what we're saying is it's not a requirement, so it won't trigger the resource consent if there's nothing in the plan.
So I know through commercial ownership, the biggest return you can get is a car park. So commercially, to put a car park in, you can get that bigger rent, you can get the larger value in your home, and you're leaving it to the people to decide on what they want to do. Whereas now it's a rule, they must have it in, they must have the turning bay, and the impervious surfaces all complicate things up, so.
I will just make a comment too that accessible car parking would still be a requirement in the plan as well, because obviously we do need accessible parks.
Question up there from Councillor Barra. Aniora.
You're on mute. Peter, you're on mute.
Sorry, through the chair. My comments are just around, we're talking about the removal of car parks. Dargaville's definitely not there yet to be an urban area. We don't have public transport here. There's the three, I guess, criteria for meeting it. We don't have public transport. Our existing services are near the riverbank. So we need to be focusing on retreating from where our current services are. And we don't have the infrastructure. So, the removal of car parks just isn't going to work for new development in Dargaville. I just can't see Dargaville being part of this. But yeah, point taken. I mean, Mangawhai is probably going to get there, but at what cost to Dargaville if we have to do a blanket national policy statement over the whole district. Where does that leave development for Dargaville and the failings that will result from that if we don't look at getting ourselves up to speed with all of the public transport and infrastructure issues that we currently have. That's my thoughts on that.
Thank you, councillor. Actually, Ron was first. Councillor Menison.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I think there should be as much trust in the market as possible. Most people could add a car park if they needed one. They could buy another property if they didn't need one, and they could exercise the judgments that's appropriate for themselves. Instead, if you legislate to restrict it, you restrict it for all, not just the people that are requiring it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Erin Wilson-Collins.
Thank you. Just a question in regards to the effect that this change would have on existing car parking. If there was a change of use of a business, or is there any flow-on effect to what's already established?
Yeah, so thinking about, I'll just use the commercial zone as an example. Say we've got the warehouse and something else moves in there, say Mitre 10, for example, which might have more traffic flow. If the change, so sometimes change of use does trigger consent depending on what activity goes in there. It could be that it's not quite right for the zone or what have you, but if there's no parking requirements in the district plan, then they would basically inherit what's already there in terms of the warehouse car park. I'll just use that warehouse in Dargaville as an example.
Yeah.
But yeah, so sometimes change of use does trigger district plan requirements, but if there's nothing in the plan to say you need to add more parks, then it wouldn't.
So just to use your example, just for clarification, because that car parking area is quite large because there was a building removed.
Yeah.
Anyway, so if someone came in and built in the middle of that, they wouldn't have to actually expand any car parking.
Wouldn't have thought so.
Okay. Sorry, second question, just in regards to the operative district plan. If you're saying that if we decide that we are an urban environment, the operative district plan has to change straight away, what effect does that have on current plan changes?
Current plan changes, so through the chair, current plan changes are plan changes to the operative district plan. Right? So that's part of that process.
Yeah, and I'd say so plan change is usually zoning and they'll propose their own set of provisions sometimes. So it depends on what they propose. But if there's no longer those requirements in there, then that would be reflected in the private plan change. Or if they don't have any specific provisions, when it comes time to develop that site, they would fall on the operative district plan, which wouldn't have car parking requirements, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does.
Councillor Vincent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My feedback is I just think it's a bit ridiculous that we consider our district an urban type of, well, subject to this national policy statement. My two reasons being, one is the only public transport we have anywhere in the district is for about 5 or 6 weeks over Christmas at Mangawhai, which is just a bus that goes from the village to out to the heads on a regular basis. And the main growth area, being once again Mangawhai, does not have any form of comprehensive public water supply. So I just find it really difficult to treat any part of the district as an urban environment. That's my view. Thank you. I mean, as far as this question about the compulsory removal of the parking requirement, that's a discretion which we could exercise on as part of our review of the district plan if we wanted to. Cheers. Bye.
Councillor Ash.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, so my view, first of all, a question for you, Catherine. You mentioned Kaipara as a urban development, which doesn't mean Mangawhai, Dargaville, but the whole district, right? But then you also mentioned that the population may not necessarily reach 10,000 by 2034. We are already 26,000 in Kaipara.
So
That's one question.
Yep.
No, go on.
Yep.
There's another one I have. Yeah.
Okay, I might, Derek Foyer's online and he has done the report with the population projection. So would it be helpful if maybe he talked to the section in his report? So there's a population projection for the West Coast side, Dargaville, and then there's a population projection which is a little bit more complicated for Mangawhai, given that Derek has looked at vacant homes as well as where people are commuting to and from. So it might just be helpful if he gave a little overview of where we're going to be by 2034. Would that be helpful?
Is that really helpful when it's not relevant right now? We're needing to make a decision on whether we
Councillor
meet.
Panayoro, can you,
Councillor
Panayoro, can you put your hand up, please? I've got other people waiting.
Sorry, through the chair. Through the chair, is it relevant when we are needing to make a decision now on whether we meet the definition, as opposed to whether we're projected in 10 years to have the population to meet the definition?
It's a decision-making meeting.
Yeah.
Please.
Councillor, thank you. Councillor Aaron Wilson?
Sorry, I was just saying, can we just be very clear that this is not a decision-making meeting?
No, it's not. It's a review process where we give our feedback
Thank you.
and direction. Yep.
Yeah. So if the case by case is town-based, because I went through this whole, and there are examples of Wellsford and little towns and all, and maybe Huntley or Waikato or whatever. Neil Taylor is a consultant, I guess, is it?
So Neil's actually a casual employee for KDC.
Okay, all right. So doesn't matter. I was just curious. So is it possible then we can make a urban development situation on parts of district, as you said, Mangawhai can be urban and Dargaville is not? Is it possible? That's my second thing.
Yeah, so the difficulty with the national policy statement is that it applies to your whole district.
Okay.
So there doesn't seem to be any discretion to earmark an urban environment and not the other. But I think what might be important is that as we move through the district plan review process, obviously there will be a lot of discussion about whether it is or isn't pending the outcome of decision. If council changes its view in the future, and it could be in 2 years' time, 3, 5, we can revisit this. So it's not something that this council's bound to for the next 10 years. We can come back to this. It's just that we would like for the district plan review to have some direction that's through formal resolution, so that when we're faced with challenges, appeals in the Environment Court, we can come back and say, well, this is what our council decided here, and this is why. And it could be that we decide it's not, Kaipara as a whole is not fitting into that urban environment definition, but in time to come, council might change their view on that, and that's perfectly okay.
Okay,
Thank you. Can I have a question from Jonathan Larson, please?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I just really just have a comment more and if we're going to use a bit of common sense and decide whether we're an urban development from sort of the common use of the term urban, if you take an aerial photograph of the whole district and look at it, I think that will tell you a reasonably good answer. I think that what Councillor Vincent has said is quite appropriate. We barely have any public transport. We don't even have water supply. That may evolve in the future, but some of these predictions here, who knows if they'll actually come to fruition given our current economic climate. We might see everything go to a halt. Those predictions were made from a time of unprecedented growth, which is now rapidly changing. But I also concur with the points made by Councillor Manderson in that commercial imperatives will drive what people do and don't need, and you're not going to get people building a supermarket and not providing any parking. They do all their modelling on the number of customers they want to be commercially successful. Similarly with your residential landlord, get more money, as Councillor Sanders has said, if he's got premium property. So I don't think there's a lot of point in wasting too much more time debating whether we are or aren't an urban environment. I think it's quite clear that we're not.
Thank you. Councillor Lambeth.
Yeah, thank you, through the Mayor, this is supplementary to what we're talking about. Far North Holdings are doing a development down at the end of Ranfurly Street where it is medium density housing and there is not car parking associated to each individual building. There is collective car parking. So for all of you, it may be a great chance to have a look at that and see that experiment at a little extent of where that's going. Thank you.
There is parking.
Councillor Paniora, can you put your hand up, please, so I can organise that?
Just to correct, there is parking, not on driveways, but immediately adjacent to each building.
That's what it is.
That's right. Councillor Manderson.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we must be mindful of the possibility that things are going to be much more difficult financially in the years ahead. At the same time, we're also considering the need for population growth. People are already disincentivised by the extent of the legislation and the costs. We should only do for the community what the community cannot do for itself and leave the maximum of decision-making to the people with the money, looking at their own circumstances, their family, their finances and such like. So that's my recommendation. Thank you.
Councillor Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Catherine, just a question of clarification. If this were to be applied, and I actually agree with Councillor Larson, but if it were to be applied, is it only a matter of the parking relative to resource consent? You know, so if you have to apply for a resource consent.
So that's one aspect. So the other is the policies that I talked about. So we have to implement the policies of the NPSUD.
Yep.
And so that would mean, and we do need to do a fair amount of this anyway for the district plan review, but assessing, demand for housing and policy 5 or 6. We have to make sure that there's at least sufficient development capacity to meet expected demand for housing and business land over the short, medium and long term, which we do anyway for the district plan review, but we're required to do it as part of this if we are deemed an urban environment. So it might give rise, and I'll just give a little example of, we did look at places like Warkworth and Wellsford and what was happening there in terms of the connection to Auckland. And so those areas have been captured as urban environments also, even though they're quite small. But what that means is they now sort of feed into the bigger Auckland picture, if you like. And so Derek did look at the relationship between those areas and Mangawhai, for example, to see whether that would have any sort of influence on Mangawhai, but it doesn't really. So what we would be looking at, though, potentially if we are an urban environment, is probably akin to, higher density development in the future. And that's like really small scale sort of apartment type living. And that's the conversation obviously we'll have today in terms of subdivision density and the type of development that elected members want to see in terms of growing Kaipara. So urban environment gives that sort of nod to more intensification. That helps.
Well, yes, it does, but we still don't have, as has been expressed, we don't have anything like a public transport system. I mean, I think so. There is that need, and if somebody wants to build a house, no matter how big or small, they want parking, they want a garage. There is in this, there's no ability to stop them doing that.
That's right.
Councillor
Yeah. The second which I wanted to say was, again, English is my second language, remember that. But the very basis of this advantage is, if I read it right, you said, if you are considered an urban environment, there is no car parking requirement, right? We are not an urban. So people are being asked by the consultant sitting in South Highland, where they're building a house in a paddock, what is the car parking requirement? Which is an anomaly. I don't understand. It should be the other way around. If it's an urban requirement, that's the time you say, well, do you really need it? So I very much doubt the premise, or unless it's a mistake, why we should have car parking requirement in a rural environment and not in an urban. If I hope I understand right.
Stop you having a car rash. Realise.
Councillor Manderson?
Get a horse.
Through you, Mr Mayor, I think that the people here are always looking at it with current technology. Future technology is you don't need a car park, you'll just be able to ring for one on your phone and it will come to you. So why you're legislating to fit out everybody with car parks at the moment astounds me. Thank you.
Yeah. Councillor Paniora, so you got your hand up there?
Yeah, I just want to add that we keep on getting fixated on the car parks, but it's the public transport network. So they assume that the public transport in an area will be able to withstand picking people up and taking them to the main centres so that there's no need for car parks. We're not there yet. So it's not just the car parks, it's the public transport goes hand in hand with it.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Paniora. I agree with you. I think we need to be flexible going forward, and I think you intimated that it still lies with the house builder, the commercial builder. You know, what they want to do is they can still provide provision. Yeah, good. Thank you. Shall we move on? Yep.
Okay, I think that's probably well covered all my slides, to be honest, Your Worship. So I feel like we've probably come to the conclusion on the national policy statement on urban development. So how do you want to proceed? Do you want us to, we will obviously prepare a paper going forward for council, adoption of a resolution to the effect. I don't know if you wanted to provide any specific comments on that, but.
Yeah, I think we've given directions, so you can forward with that. Yep.
Okay.
I'm quite clear.
Question.
Councillor Paniora. Yep.
Sorry, through the chair. So if you are going to prepare a paper, can you maybe prepare it on whether there's any ability for Mangawhai to deviate from Dargaville in any way with that? Is that a possibility?
So for the chair, I'll speak to that. As we've already mentioned, Councillor Paniora, the thing with the NPSUD is that if Mangawhai is deemed an urban environment by council, then by proxy the whole of the district is. We can't.
I know, I understand that point. What I'm saying is whether there's any other ways for Mangawhai to take advantage of the benefits of that that policy statement, but without us having to apply it across the district.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll ask them to refer to that. Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Let's move on to zoning.
All right. So this was added in very last minute, the zoning into the public part of today's presentation. So apologies, there's not a specific mention in the report, but we've obviously prepared the presentation. And this is just to step you through how we've arrived at the draft zoning and just to give a bit of context and background to that. So you'll know that since the November briefing that we've received a whole lot of feedback. Zoning's always a very popular topic in a district plan review. So we've been working our way through that. There's quite a number of different examples of what people want to do. And there's a lot of individual property owners that want specific things. So we're not going to drown you with all of that in this session. But just be cognizant there are lots of feedback on the zoning. We need to keep the strategic direction at the front of our mind when we're talking about the zones, because this is what goes on the ground. So this is how we're going to plan our land use. And as part of the discussion we've just had, we have to ensure that we've got sufficient land for towns and villages across Kaipara to grow without constraining them. And today's presentation, I'm just going to talk you through a number of the constraints that we're having to consider in the zoning process. So That includes the location of flood and coastal hazard areas, the location of highly productive soils, which, as Neil's talked a lot about this morning, is the new MPS on highly productive land that's just come about since we did the draft district plan, and the capacity of infrastructure and the demand for urban development.
Excuse me.
Councillor Erin Wilson.
Thank you. I actually have a question, just going back to the first item, I'm afraid, because I'm a bit lost. We listened and obviously read our agendas about all that feedback, but we didn't actually discuss any of that. Is that meaning that we're happy with the changes that have been proposed?
So through the chair, I'll speak to that. So Neil hasn't proposed any specific changes yet. So he talked.
He's made suggestions, but what happens with that now?
He will come back to a future briefing with his suggested amendments to the strategic direction chapter as it track changes to show the team.
Okay.
And the team are happy with that.
Yeah.
See from there. Yeah.
Okay.
And can I just make a note there as well that the strategic direction chapter, because we've got to hear all the other topics which fall under that.
Yeah.
It is a bit of an iterative process, so we'll probably bring that back to you a bit later in the schedule.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I can concentrate on this one now.
Okay.
Okay, so some of you, this will be old stuff, but I'll explain. So we don't get a lot of choice for district planning in terms of our zones. We have the national planning standards, and I've tried to capture the little table there from the national planning standards, which basically you sort of cherry pick which zones you want to use in your district plans. There are some descriptors in the planning standards as well. So that tells you a little bit about what the intention of that zone is. So we have used that information to develop the draft district plan zones there. So I'm just going to step you through what we've got there at the moment. And obviously this was based around largely the spatial plans, because spatial plan work had already been done. But it's probably worth pointing out that there is a little bit of a disalignment between the spatial plans and the proposed, the national planning standards, which timing wasn't great. So there's a little bit of confusion there. But anyway, just keep it in your mind that the national planning standards are the zones that we must use. So when you look at spatial plans, they might just have some slightly different names. So for the residential zones, we have picked 3. So this was to differentiate what we were trying to achieve with obviously land use development and densities, which we will talk about as well. So the large lot residential was really to basically cover bigger size lots in the residential areas, low densities a little bit smaller, and then medium being our smallest density for the residential zones. So that's pretty stock standard sort of suburbia type subdivision there. And then we've got the commercial zones, and our previous council, we brought to them whether they wanted to do multiple commercial zones, or should we just have one commercial zone across the board? And then of course with the industrial zones as well, we proposed light and heavy industrial, but there are a couple of options there. So where we landed on was just the 3 commercial and industrial zones, and that was just to kind of keep it easy, and differentiating the light from the heavy. So the light industrial is more like sort of most industrial type activities. Heavy is your Silver Fern farms and your Fonterra dairy factories, those types of bigger industries that typically need a little bit more space around them for reverse sensitivity, whereas the light industry has a whole combination of things that go in there. The open space and recreation zones, there were a couple of options here, and we felt that this would do a much better job in the district plan of our reserves in terms of areas that are like bush, people to go and visit, our recreation reserves and things, versus our open space, which is more your parks and open space areas more in an urban setting, although there are some open spaces that have our rural halls on them. So if you think of, I don't know, the Marahimo Hall, for example, that's got an area of land there, and I'm pretty sure that one we've zoned open space just to utilise those rules. So it does, the open space does give provision for a little bit of development there, whereas the natural open space is more about protection of the naturalness of the space there. And then we've got sport and active recreation zone, which there's not a huge number of examples of that, but that's just to cover like Sportsville, for example, and some of our, I think we've got a little bit here in Mangawhai as well. It's a split zone, I think, between open space and sport and active recreation zone. But that was helpful because the previous operative district plan doesn't have anything to kind of differentiate what we have. So we thought those were really helpful zones. Then moving on to the rural zones, where we landed previously was with 4 rural zones. So we've got the settlement zone there, which is our smaller communities like Kaihu, Tingataroria, Poto, and mostly areas that are not serviced. And that's a new thing for the district and kind of an exciting opportunity as well for development there.
I can interrupt you there just a little bit.
Of course, Your Worship.
Question from Councillor Manderson.
Thank you. Can I just seek some clarification at this stage? If we take the likes of your proposed zoning for commercial and industrial zones, now many commercial activities have to change their activities from time to time. Does this mean they're going to be restricted to commercial, light commercial or heavy industrial? And therefore the planners are becoming the de facto managers of the future solvency of that business? Or does that permission apply for a certain period of time?
So depending on where you put your commercial zone, so generally commercial's used around your towns.
Wherever you put the commercial zones, those subzones will apply. So I'm asking the question that if their requirement of their business is that their activity changes, they're from commercial to light commercial or heavy industrial, do they have to shut up shop and apply again?
Well, it would depend on how flexible the rules are for the commercial zone. If it's a business that's in the commercial zone changing to industrial, and let's just say if they were taking a leap to a heavy industry activity, there might be some fish hooks in the plan, depending on where we land with the provisions for the commercial zone. If it's going the other way from a light or heavy industry to commercial, it's probably not likely to happen, but.
So are you saying that having spent their money, the future of their business is now largely going to be determined by council planners?
No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. But it depends on what's in the district plan. So generally with the commercial and industrial zones, you try and make the rules as flexible and enabling as possible for the types of business that you want to happen in those zones. So that's the point of zoning, is to put things in the right place. So we're managing the reverse sensitivity conflicts we talked about earlier. And also, yeah, like I said, commercial zones are generally in your towns. So that's all your dairies and your street shops, things like that. So you wouldn't expect your light industrial activity to set up in one of those locations, because it needs to be able to manage the effects of noise and things like that. So that's why we have the light industry and heavy industry.
So correct me if I'm wrong. So whether it's council, councillors, local government or central government, the property owner, the business owner is now going to be very vulnerable to any changes in the future legislation.
Well, I would say no, but I can't predict what commercial properties or landowners will do. So a bit of a difficult question, Councillor Manderson.
Councillor Paniora.
Thank you, through the chair. I've asked this question once and I'll ask it again. If Plan Change 81 for the racecourse is successful, given that council has only proposed one heavy industrial area being the same land on the racecourse, then where does council plan to put heavy industrial?
So through the chair, council, which includes your team, will need to have those discussions, and those discussions haven't been had yet.
Hang on a second, but wasn't there data and research that your team suggested you'd use to propose heavy industrial on the racecourse land? So are you saying that that is now a decision for the governing body to make as to where heavy industrial zone will be placed in Dargaville if 81 is successful. Is
So
that
through
the,
So through the chair, the spatial plans are long-term 30 to 50-year non-statutory documents which don't have much rigor behind them. There's no site-specific analysis behind them. So the community of Dargaville and the West Coast, through the process, suggested that land around the racecourse could be a good site in the future for heavy industrial land. The site-specific details need to be teased out through the district plan review process, which we're doing now.
Thank you.
so there's no alternative for heavy industrial today as we speak? There's no alternative areas earmarked for council, through council for heavy industrial as we speak today? And if the plan change is approved, where's the meatworks and businesses like that going to go?
So through the draft, through the chair, through the draft district plan, we proposed extra heavy industrial land around where the Silver Ferns Farms currently is zoned. So we've proposed to expand that heavy industrial zoning around Silver Fern Farms to enable growth around there as well.
Okay, has that just happened in the last couple of months? Because I haven't seen that updated version. Has that just recently occurred?
No.
Because it's not in the online version.
The online maps are only the draft maps, Councillor Paniona, at the moment. So we're yet to have that discussion with elected members about the proposed zoning.
I'd appreciate seeing an updated version that, that you're referring to.
Thank you. Councillor Vincent, got your hand up there as well?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I'd just like to return to another scenario as Councillor Manderson's taken us down. If someone has a residential property and they decide they'd like to open up a shop, are you suggesting under the current rules that someone would actually have to apply for permission to do that?
No. So again, when we get to the nuts and bolts of the zone provisions, there will be rules. For example, home occupations will be something that is a permitted activity in the plan with limits on how many people you can have and things like that. But no, I'm not saying we're going to restrict people doing activities, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that the zoning kind of sets the foundation as to where you want different types of activities and land use to occur in the district.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was actually, if I take the tongue out of the side of my cheek, I could perhaps explain a bit more explicitly in terms of what is an answer to Councillor Manderson, I guess, if you'll permit me, Mr. Mayor, is just the answer is yes. Under the operative plan and any future plan as well. If you're intending a change of use such that it is incompatible with the current zoning, then yes, you would need permission, I would expect. Isn't that the answer? I'll shut up now.
Okay, Councillor Lambeth.
Yeah, I see there's 25 different zones that the government gave you and you chose 16 of them. You went the full hog on the rural, so you've grabbed every rural zone there was available. But you've gone over, missed out stuff like the general residential zones, and are you able to talk to that on what didn't comply with those other zones, or did you only have a certain amount you could get? It's obvious metropolitan and a high rise and all that. That's obvious why that hasn't come, but the general residential?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Councillor Lambeth. So the reason why we picked the 3 residential zones as opposed to just a general residential zone was mostly in response to Maungawhai's spatial plan, which really got down into the high density development versus medium versus low. And then you've got the large lot, which is bigger again. So we chose that to try and give a little bit more focus in the draft plan different densities applying. And I'm not saying it's the right answer. In fact, maybe a general residential would suit Kaipara because it could enable everything to happen in there. But what I'm saying is the reason we chose that, and we have had feedback on this as well, there is a lot of support for what we have put into the draft. But we, again, in terms of the conversation we've just had on the urban environment, medium density residential, if you look at the new national planning standards for medium density, what are they called? The urban design guidelines, is very intensive, very high density type development. So it's whether we think Kaipara is suited to medium density development or low density development, but that's why we've got 3. It was just to give more focus, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. That's where we got some feedback. So a general res could in fact do the same job.
Just as supplementary, that is there any way that we have access to what the general residential model was, or?
Oh, just in terms of the descriptor of yep. So in the national planning standards, if I just take you back to, I think it was in section. On page.
The way you're looking at my fear is that you may have got too specific on different and are narrowing the scope of what is a growing and changing environment if it's residential.
Yeah, it was more to try and get alignment because we had the spatial plan work done. It was we literally sat down around a table and went, what is the best fit based on what we've already done, and how does this now match up with our planning standards? So if you go to the national planning standards, I don't have it right here in front of me, but I think I did provide a link through the report, through the public report.
Sorry, Catherine, through the chair, one of the points of direction that the team is asking your team today is, are you comfortable with the proposed zones, i.e. large lot residential, medium density residential, blah, blah, blah? Would you want one single residential zone? What's your feedback here? And we'll take that on board.
Thank you.
Councillor Aaron Wilson.
Collins, can I just ask about the general residential zone? Would that then mean that you could do any sort of density of housing within that zone?
You'd still set a minimum. So let's just take the medium density as an example, which is the lowest, it's 400. You could still use 400 as your minimum. That's not to say everyone has to use 400, but that would be your minimum size, for example, that you would achieve in that zone.
But you'd then have no control over where those densities.
That's right. And that's what we were trying to get at with the focus of the zoning, because remembering these transpire to areas, spatial areas on a map. And we'll show you a little bit of this a bit later on.
Okay.
But you will get to see how it's been taken from the spatial plan map and put into the district plan map to try and give that life. And that was really around what the communities wanted in terms of subdivision lot size density. So it's that steep up. I think we've got 700, 750, Paul, he knows all the numbers off the top of his head, for the low density, and then we step up to 1,000 square metres for the larger lot. So it's just like a graduated approach. So if we used a general residential and just had one, anyone could subdivide at those sizes, but the minimum would be 400.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But that's when you end up with unplanned.
Yeah, it's probably a little less cultivated if you might not end up with the outcomes that you're wanting in areas that were possibly better for low density, for example. And that's where we have to look at places like Dargaville that have some topographical challenges. Some of those sites are never going to be 400 square metres. They'll only be bigger sizes, but the district plan will allow them to go to 400. So you might get people trying to maximise their yield. And, you have to watch where it's been happening on the ground. So,
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Look, I think some people need to go and have a break. Someone already has. So we'll have a 15-minute break and come back at 11:10. Thank you. Hit the button on there or what? Opening the meeting. Okay, cool.
Issue, please.
Okay, welcome back.
Muted or?
Thank you.
It's on now.
So we'll continue with this presentation.
No, I don't think so.
Catherine, are we still with you, are we? Yep.
Oh, yep. Through your worship, I'll just carry on with the explanation of the zones because we didn't quite finish the table here on the slide. So I think I got up to rural lifestyle. So just to explain what the rural lifestyle zone is, many of you will know what the rural lifestyle looks like. And that's to provide, obviously, for larger than residential lifestyle lots around the district. And then we've got the two main or true rural zones. So we've got the general rural and the rural production zone. And there was a lot of work that went into deciding whether to have one or two. And I guess the foundation behind the rural production zone was to reflect the work that KIPRA had already done with a report called KIPRA Kai. And so we're quite fortunate to have that work already done and some mapping that helped us to basically ring fence those areas of production that we want to protect. So that's why we've differentiated those areas from the general rural, and generally that's where everything else kind of happens. So I'll just quickly move off to the special purposes zones. So we have, now that the appeals have been resolved on the Mangawhai Central Private Plan change, we've got the Estuary Estates is its own special purpose zone because it has precincts within the zone that are reflected in the rules. So we will bring that, it's obviously in the operative district plan at the moment, we'll bring that into the proposed district plan. We've got a new zone for the hospital. So this is for Dargaville Hospital. This is something that we haven't had before, but it means that we can have a specific set of provisions for the hospital and the activities that will happen on the hospital land there. So that's quite exciting. And then we've got the multi-purpose zone. So the multi-purpose zone reflects our land holdings within the district. So anything that's governed under the Te Ture Whenua Māori Land Act, and those zones are to enable development of Māori land fairly readily. So a lot of councils are using the multi-purpose zone around the country to promote and enable development on that land. So that's that zone. There is one that's not on the list here, and I just want to mention it, and that's the future urban zone, which is also a special purpose zone, also known as the fuzz zone, which is quite extensively used around the country now. But this is a zone that protects rural land for future urban development. And so we'll probably get into some discussions a bit later on today about a future urban zone, but.
I'll interrupt you there.
Of course.
These special purpose zones, you can't cherry pick them, you actually custom design from your own council, do you?
So there are some on the list. If I just step back to the previous slide, you'll see that there's a grey box at the bottom.
Yes.
And then they do have recommended labels for some zones, like an airport zone, a hospital zone, etc. But we will obviously use special purpose zone for Mangawhai Central, and because it's its own sort of.
So you can custom make one to go in?
Yes.
Is that where it is?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's to be called special purpose zone, and we're not going to make the same mistake that Far North made with their notified version. They coloured everything grey, and then they had so many special purpose zones that nobody knew what was what. So Kyle, who's joining us later, he'll talk a little bit about that, but we won't make that mistake.
So as an example, through the chair, the Far North have a Cody Cliffs special purpose zone, as an example. So it's up to council's discretion.
So, sorry.
That could be the wind farm?
Potentially.
Okay. Or.
Yeah, generally you have to, there is some criteria around what you use a special purpose zone for. So it's generally things like the airfields and your key kind of regional infrastructure, if you like your hospitals and things like that, and special areas that, like the multi-purpose zone as well. So yeah, there are some criteria around what can be a special purpose zone.
Is there also flexibility with an application to subdivide to request that you be made into a zone? For example, if you wanted to build a hospital or a high school or something like that?
So generally hospitals and schools and things will designate their land. So they'll use a separate process called the designations, and they'll designate that land which sits with an underlying zoning. So it could be any zone, and then the designation sits over the top of that, and then they have authority to do what they need to do. So any requiring authority can request that from council. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so any more questions on the zones that we've used there? That just gives you a list of the.
So, yeah, I actually do have one, sorry.
Remember, yep.
On that special purpose zone, would you envisage the field days complex to be in a special purposes zone? Because it's not going to fit in the commercial activity or the rural activity, because it's used for one activity and then the other. Would that be most of the year it's used as haymaking and grazing, and then for 3 months of the year it's used very much a commercial?
I wouldn't pick a special purpose zone for a specific activity like that. I think that it would probably fall into one of the other zones, but yeah, like I say, generally a special purpose zone, because the thing with it is that you have to develop a set of provisions to go with it. So every special purpose zone has its own set of rules and its own maps and things like that. So it is a little bit of work.
Because my worry is there's so many operations in play now throughout the Kaipara in rural zones where it allows commercial activity, and they just chop and change between it as a year by year operation.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering, I know there's an existing use, right, but it's going to get a little bit hairy and difficult if they decide to buy the padding next door to expand it.
Yeah.
So that's where we're going to lose it with this current rural zone that we have. The example I gave you was the rural paddock, which uses during the school holiday, the Ritchie's buses will park there to get them out of town so they don't get vandalised. Now, that's not a rural activity. And I could give you 100 different examples of how people on those rural areas are doing this now, and I'm frightened for them from their day-to-day operation. It's going to.
Yeah, we can think a little bit more about that, because the other option other than zoning is to look at provisions within our zone chapters. So if it's, and I've seen this many examples across the country where there are some exemptions. So the Dargaville Airport is actually one of those examples. So we're not doing a special purpose zone. We decided that was actually too restrictive. What we're going to do is put some special provisions in the rural zone, and that will enable the airfield to do their activities, their site. So sometimes there are specific activities that you can provide for in the rules. Yeah. Okay. All right, I'm just going to really gloss over the spatial plans, because I guess we did cover this in the November briefing, but just to give a little bit of context, obviously, to how the zones have been adopted spatially, and we'll have Kyle with us later today to talk a little bit. He'll show us a little bit more in that space. But just if you could turn your mind just to the spatial plans, and obviously these were a community-driven document where lots of people had input into them. I'm not saying everyone was happy with them, but these provide the guidance that we've picked up to use to give life to them in the district plan. So the spatial plans are a non-statutory document, and while they give guidance and direction, there's actually little weight that can be attributed to them as a planning tool. So the district plan has far more weight. And so obviously we're trying to now push aside the operative district plan maps and come up with our new district plan maps, which will be what we notify come mid-year. So I've just given some examples in the presentation there of Mangawhai, which is quite a complex spatial plan and there's a lot of arms and legs to that. So feel free to have a look at those plans and get your head around that, but there's a lot of complexity in that one. And then if I go to a more simplistic one, Kaiwaka is a really good example of that. It's just earmarking where the community wants the growth and development to happen, where they want to focus the commercial areas, industrial areas, and the residential zones there. So you can see the Kaiwaka is quite a bit going on. And as Michael pointed out before, these are 30-year plans. So the hard task for us now is to basically make decisions about what is appropriate for the next 10 years. And there's nothing in these documents that give us heaps of guidance as to what we should be zoning in this district plan. And that's where putting out the draft last year was a good way of getting input from the community to see what they thought, because there'll be a lot of people who were involved in the spatial plans possibly expecting to have their land rezoned and then coming along to find that we haven't, or vice versa, that we have and they weren't expecting that. So, yeah, I think Mangateroto is probably a little bit more complicated than Kaiwaka, but as you can see, there's quite a bit going on there as well. So we've tried to work hard to provide a 10-year scope in the draft district plan, and that's where now the job of elected members will be to decide what do we do for the next 10-year plan and what's the comfortable fit that we're happy with notifying later this year. So any quick questions on the spatial plans? I think we've probably talked a lot about that last time, but if you've got any questions.
Through the chair, just clarification on spatial plan Kaiwaka picture.
Yes.
Maybe my eyes. There are 3 yellows there. Is it low, medium, or new high density?
It's so the really darker orange.
No, not orange. The 3 yellows.
Oh, the yellow. So there's a.
All the same.
What are they?
There's a new low density and a new medium density. And then you.
So major is medium density or low density?
So those 3 are medium,
Yes.
and that one's low.
Yeah.
These 3 are medium, that one's low.
Can I ask a question, Catherine?
Of course.
Just looking at your plan here, spatial plan for Kaiwaka,
Yes.
and you've got the rail there and that runs through open space, is it?
That would be rural.
Rural land? I'm a little concerned that opportunities, so the rail's getting upgraded big time. And the emphasis is to take traffic off the roads, particularly trucks. So then you go to your next map there for Roto, and I see we've got new industrial around rail there. I just thought that maybe there needed to be a little bit more thought given to other opportunities to use rail
Kaiwaka.
elsewhere.
Perhaps Paul could give some background context to that, but I'm thinking it's to do with the upgrade required to the state highway.
It's actually, sorry, interjecting, I believe it's actually to do with land use capability.
Yeah.
Oh, and the production.
Like Bath soil.
Like Bath soils and the
Yeah.
and the farmers specifically. We originally had an idea to put industrial area along the railway line, and the farmer identified his best soil, and for that particular purpose, we then looked to the north of Kaiwaka and put a blob to the north of Kaiwaka to identify the location on the state highway. Yes, we accepted that it is not on the railway line, and that was one of the reasons why the industrial area connected to the railway line is in the Mangateroto area.
Okay, is that a hard and fast rule that all class 1 soils, such as that one where the rail line runs through Kaiwaka, are all totally off limits? Because obviously, to me, you're not going to use all your high class soil everywhere.
We are going to talk about the constraints of the new guidance, because there are some, you have to go through quite a few hoops to demonstrate why that land, if there are alternatives. So I think, you know, the spatial plan's obviously been done as council's kind of direction.
Yep.
Not to say that we can't change our mind on that, but what I would say, and I haven't got to that part of the presentation yet, is that we would have to look very carefully at where you want to put it exactly, and is it an area that is, you know, going to make a detrimental impact on the production to the high class soils.
Right. Councillor Larson.
Sorry, if I could just speak to that, because when we go back to the spatial plan, we were anticipating the national policy statement coming, and we didn't know exactly what it was going to look like in terms of the level of protection of, you know, fragmented areas and what have you. And so now that we do know that, maybe we can have another look at that. But I think perhaps that's something for the next session.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so if everyone's happy with the spatial plans there, I've just added this slide in just to give some context, which is what we showed when we released the draft plan last year. So we looked to open up a significant amount of rural land for urban development. So it was quite a considerable jump. Our advice was that we had quite a lot, like we didn't possibly need that much. So this was a huge change for Kaipara District, but obviously there are some benefits of opening up more land, and I guess that's where we need to decide going forward whether, you know, this council is comfortable with releasing this much land for residential, commercial and industrial purposes.
Catherine, can I just interrupt you? Just sorry about that. One question.
Just going back a bit, and pardon me, I just ask a question. In Kaiwaka, Mangataroto, and nearly all towns where the highway is going through them, you have based zoning on each side of a busy highway. And I can't see that transit will ever fund overbridges in the next few years, maybe 20, 30, 40 years. So for 20, 30, 40 years, we face the probability, near certainty, in fact, I use the word certainty, that people are going to get killed by having to cross that road. And it would be a hell of a lot cheaper to, over a period of time, to take the access to those areas that have developed along the roads to the rear of those and away from that road. So can you indicate to me the things that you've taken into account in the planning considerations?
Yep. So, the spatial plans, remember that they are still quite high level, and generally what councils do after doing a spatial plan is they do a structure plan. And a structure plan will look at, you'll have seen on the spatial plan maps that there were some earmarked, I'll just use Mangataroto as an example, because you'll see there were some alternative routes indicated in there in that spatial plan. A structure plan would go a little bit in more detail, and you'd almost get to the point where you look at if a subdivision happened, where would you be looking at those kind of key linkages and things. So we haven't got that level of detail, Councillor Manderson, and what we're trying to do with the district plan is obviously come along and zone the land. So when we do that, it will be up to the developers that come in and say, right, we're ready to put 300 lots here and another developer with 300 lots next door. We're going to have to be strategic about where those accesses go. So if council wants to start, and you're quite right, NZTA don't typically like major subdivision development coming off state highways, so they'll look for ways to get the traffic coming off that. And so we've got that opportunity again when we get to that subdivision level, because unfortunately we don't have a document below this one that says, right, it's got to go here. And you can usually indicate where you want your roads and connections to go. This is still quite high level, the spatial plan. Does that help?
However, I will make the point that you, to a certain extent, are influencing the communities to see it your way. Instead
from the community.
Yeah, so
This is
over chair,
plan.
this is the community's document. So the council consulted vigorously with the community when this document was developed. So it's not Catherine's document, it's.
But the community are not planners. Most of the community are totally unaware of the planning considerations, and they're fed in each case a suggestion that actually enhances the access to the highway. And you have a hang of a job with Transit New Zealand to get another entry. And yet they're being legislated for it. And I'm a little bit critical. I'm really appreciative of what you're doing, but I'm a little critical that you're not leading the community on the major issues that they need to consider at this stage now, because it's going to get more and more difficult with time.
I think in response to that, through your worship, I mean, our job is to provide the zoning to open up areas of land for development. And that's the purpose of this district plan review, is to start enabling more growth and more development. When I joined this council 2 years ago, the first thing I heard was that we don't have enough houses. We need to get more houses in the district, and we were also fighting off potential private plan changes, and there were lots and lots of them. And as you'll know, we've got 3 underway at the moment. So it is a real thing. We can either just keep putting band-aids over the problem or zone it and provide for that future growth over the next 10 years. So we're trying to do it that way. And I hear what you're saying. Some of that detail, unfortunately, yes, we can drive it through things like the infrastructure provisions, and you'll hear a lot more about that as we move through our program. But today's discussion is obviously the zoning and trying to set the foundation for the land use development to happen and occur in the district. So so that's where we're at. And hear what you're saying. And I think as things start to evolve, once the zoning is there and people start to develop, council's role will be to make sure developers are doing the right thing and trying to get access in the right places and things like that. So hopefully it gives you a little bit of peace of mind that we won't be turning our mind away from those issues, but we're still at this very high level of trying to just get the zoning into the plan.
Good.
All right. So I'm just going to jump forward again. So I'm going to just talk us through some of the constraints of zoning. So we've already talked a little bit about this with regards to the MPSHPL, but I'm going to dive into a little bit more detail here. But I'll start with the hazard mapping, because I think this is one of the things when we were developing the draft district plan last year and the maps that were in the draft. The Northern Regional Council had just recently put out their new hazard maps. So our job was to pick up the NRC's hazard maps and to look at where those are. And so we've actually done a job since the draft went out just to go back again and to check that any zoning that we'd proposed is not lying in a hazard area. But obviously we want to make sure we're doing a good job of that. So that's one of the things that Kyle, who you'll meet later, he's been helping us to overlay the hazard maps onto the zoning maps and make sure that we're not putting new residential zoning, for example, in high risk flood hazard areas and things like that. There will be some more information coming from the NRC in respect to the Raupo drainage catchment, and we're hoping to have that any day. I don't know if, Michael, you've got an update on when that's likely to land, but hopefully in the next few months before the plan gets notified, because that will have a positive impact on Ruwai and what zoning that we can include for Ruwai. But yeah, so any questions on the hazard mapping, because that has a significant impact on where we can actually put new residential, commercial, industrial, probably not so much, excuse me, industrial zoning, because you can build buildings up and do floor levels and things, but we don't want to be putting habitable buildings into flood risk areas.
So Lambert.
Finding endless problems when we've got a large rural lot and we want to put a house on there, and it goes down to the harbour, and there's a little corner of it is in the flood zone.
Yep.
And it flags the whole site.
Yep, yep.
Is there any provisions that if it's above 10 metres in altitude, that we can just have some simplification on that?
So Councillor Lambeth, that's the difference between having a rule that says your site versus your overlay.
Yes.
That's where we need to be really clear. So you're not being caught if you're outside of that.
Yeah.
Because that's just silly, right? So.
Yeah.
I see Mark Vincent's got his hand up. Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was just going to say I was advised from the chairman of the Raupo Drainage Committee a couple of weeks ago that the updated flood hazard modelling had been released. So I'm surprised that the regional council hasn't shared it with us yet. So that's something you might want to follow up. It shouldn't be months away.
That's good news.
Through the chair, I'll follow up, Councillor Vincent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Larson?
Your worship, how does this part here relate to the mapping of coastal inundation zones in the regional policy?
In terms of like the zoning and giving, because if there's, sorry, if there's any areas that are in those high risk coastal inundation areas, then obviously we need to look closely at whether that's the right spot for them. So it's just about saying, let's look at all of the hazard mapping information that we have and then determine other zones in the wrong places. There are some areas, but not many, I think, that we've picked up on that weren't. So Bailey's Beach was a good example of that. Sorry, voice is going.
So just in terms of that, the coastal inundation line from the regional policy statement has been overlaid onto our
map.
And since that work was done, we've had IPCC admissions that the modelling is out of whack, which obviously has flow-on effects to the regional policy statement maps, which then has flow-on effects to what we're saying can and can't be occupied.
Yep.
Where are NRC in terms of revising those lines so they actually reflect the now accepted modelling?
It's a bit of a chase, really. Mike, I don't know if you want to speak to it, but we can only go on the information that's been publicly released from the Northern Regional Council. So there is talk of work happening. Mike might want to speak to that.
Chair, would it be useful if I reach out to my colleagues at the Regional Council and ask them to come to a briefing of Council and brief your team about the hazard maps and where things are at? Since the NRC is leading this process and since, as Catherine's mentioned, we have to follow their lead in this space, I think it'd be quite handy.
Okay, well, possibility. Yeah, just one other thing on the same sort of topic. It's not exactly what you're talking about here, but the same as we're talking about NRC, with regard to the land use capability mapping that we have.
Yes.
Are NRC ground truthing that mapping, or is the current mapping accepted to be accurate? Where are we at with that?
So the Regional Council are going to be doing some more work. We're actually ahead of them. So the work that we've already done with the Kaikakai in terms of looking at our highly productive areas. The 1974 land use capability maps are a little bit out of date. So Northern Regional Council are working for the whole of Northland on that, but they haven't really kick-started it. That's what I understand from talking to them about that work, because we've been working with a similar shared expert on the soils issue, who's going to be working at a regional level as well as district, because I didn't want our work to be behind whatever they come up with, if that makes sense, in terms of if they're going to say, look, these are all new areas of highly productive land and it doesn't match our maps, it's a bit of a waste of time us doing our stuff at the moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know, it's a moving.
Yeah, but not behind us. So we are talking, I've got a meeting next week with them to talk about the work that we've done, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec with the highly productive soils as well.
Okay, that'd be good. I haven't looked into any of this too closely, but I've been having some contacts from people recently who are being asked to get soil tests done to determine whether they've got restrictions under the national policy statement, I think.
Yes.
And I would have thought that either our maps stand, and if people don't agree with our maps, they have to go and prove that they are incorrect by getting a soil test. But otherwise, it's our responsibility to actually front up with accurate mapping, not put the onus back onto each individual landowner to demonstrate that. Now, I'm just flagging that now, and I haven't looked at it in too much detail.
Yep. So I'll jump ahead to the MPSHPL in a sec.
Yeah.
You raised some really good points there, because when they put that document out, they were relying on a document from 1974, which is done at a scale that's not helpful for people.
Yeah.
And so that's the dilemma that councils are now in, is that if you've got a subdivision or land use application that's impacted, you have to decide, is this, like, are you on or are you off? And if you're on, fortunately goes on the applicant to show whether it is highly productive soils or not. And 9 times out of 10, it may not be, because of the scale in which the mapping was done.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah.
That's a no.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question is more of the process at the council level.
Yeah.
So what's the story with the properties or the landowners who have built on the flood zone and they want to do further building? And so the geotech and all those things and consent has been done. Would they be asked again to go through the rigmarole of that? And would they then be, based on the new mapping, disallowed to have a house?
Yeah, so this comes back to the provisions that we're yet to see. So when we come to the natural hazards topic in a couple of, I think it's next month actually, we will step you through the provisions that will relate to it. And there are some exemptions, things like minor works. If it's a big scale change, like I'm assuming if someone's built a house, they've spent the money, it's good to go because they've proven themselves. If they want to do a minor addition, our rules do provide for permitted activities. So it depends if they're doing a massive scale change or smaller. And so we'll step you through those provisions.
Sorry, my question is this. Why should make a difference if it's a minor or major when we are doing, whether it is in the zone, the flooding zone and the geotech and soil, it's going to be no different for the same property?
Assuming it is no different, sometimes if you're increasing the area, you know, the area of a building, or if you're building up a building platform, say, I'll just use an example. In the Waikato, we had an industrial site where they had a big platform, but they added on a whole new shed, and it changes the dynamics of the way the floodwaters operate in the site to get it off the property. So it depends if it's geotechnically sound still with the modifications that they make. So depending on the scale of the works proposed, it may or may not impact. And it could be just a case of getting the same geotech to come out and say, look, this is what I'm doing. Is it still okay? Yes, no, or is it not? Because the thing is, you don't want to be putting people in further risk if they're modifying their site, you know, to a large degree. So I think it just depends on what the activity is, and also the significance of the risk. Some areas will be high risk, and we'll talk a lot more about the high risk areas, and some will be very minor, low level, might be a risk of very small scale flooding. So it just depends on what that risk is.
Thank you, Catherine. My idea was just to ask how much process driven we are.
Yes.
And we are actually impairing the process where it's not required.
Yeah.
That should not be there.
Yeah, no, and certainly agree with you on that. Yep, thank you.
That's Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Further to Councillor Larson's point, you talked about the NRC mapping and your way to see that.
Yep.
Who takes precedence, ours or theirs?
So with the new MPS that has been put out, the Regional Council have the responsibility to provide the mapping of the highly productive soils, and they've got a 5-year window to do that. And at the moment, as things lie, we're in a transition phase, which means we rely on these 1974 land use capability maps. So everyone gets caught in Northland by that until the regional council come up with their new maps. But in the conversations I've had with the Northern Regional Council, because of the work we're doing already on the district plan, I don't want to find our council in the position where they're telling us it's wrong. So we've put in a lot of time and energy already to mapping where our rural production zones are and where our highly productive soils are. So we also have an expert helping us, I'll talk more about this soon, to assess areas. And so we'd like to think that our information is going to feed into what the Northern Regional Council do for the whole of Northland, because let's face it, mapping Northland is a big task. And the experts already told me that Kaipara is actually in a really good space with the 1974 maps. When they were done, they're actually done really well versus other parts of Northland where it wasn't done so well. So we're actually in a good position already.
But at the end of the day, it'll be NRC's mapping.
It will be their mapping that takes precedent in 5 years' time. But in the meantime, we're in this transition phase. Yep.
Bit of time to make sure we align.
Exactly. Yep. So hopefully that answers your question.
Councillor Williams, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a query. NRC also maps tsunami evacuation zones and all of that around the coast. I just wondered, how is that taken into account with the district plan? It's not down as any hazard, or is it something that isn't needed to be in a district plan? I just wondered because, yeah, I've got that mapping.
Yeah, so through the chair, that's a really good question. And tsunami evacuation planning is done under the Management Act, and it's the community response element to it. It's not a district requirement, shall we say. So yes, we have to have the coastal erosion and coastal inundation mapping that the regional council has mapped, but not the tsunami maps in the district plan, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you probably wouldn't want to put it in a district plan because then it's sort of locked in until you have to do a plan change. So if the community ever decides to move their point of evacuation areas, they'd have to do a plan change every time. So it wouldn't be efficient to do that.
Okay.
Councillor Lambert.
Just going back to that regional council, as the big brother, was a parent body for this highly productive land. We're going to go down this planning process, or you propose to go down this planning process of a massive expenditure of money. And you now indicate to me that this could all change in 4 years. Is there any way we can narrow the regional council down into guaranteeing that they're not going to change ours if we are so confident that our productive soils are right?
Yeah, I think there is, because they'll need to go through their process, and if we've gone through our full district plan review by that stage too, our maps will be fairly locked in. And this is working collaboratively, because I think if we wouldn't want them to appeal our maps, for example, as part of this process. So I mean, that just wouldn't make sense. But yeah, I think there is always the risk that they do something different, but we'd like to think that we're working collaboratively on this one, and the requirements of the NPS is that they do set the maps. So if there are any changes, then we would need to know about it, and we wouldn't know about it until they release their maps.
That's the only way of hooking them in.
That's what I'm saying. Like, if we continue to work collaboratively, and we're working with the same soils expert on this, who will be ultimately guiding both the NRC and us. So
yeah, so for the chair, I can say with virtual certainty that the NRC will pick up and adopt the mapping that we're doing as we're in front of them in the space here specifically.
Yeah.
We are talking about a $4 or $5 million certainty bet here, aren't we? So we've got to be sure about it for the backnotes.
Sorry, could you just clarify, when you're talking about our mapping, you're talking about our mapping of
the highly productive soils.
So we are going to go out and ground truth all of the NRC maps ourselves at a KDC ratepayer cost when NRC are required to provide it? No?
well, the requirements of the NPS is that council bears that burden, so it's their cost to do it. Is it Manaki Whenua, have actually already done quite a lot of mapping of New Zealand, and I don't know how much mapping they've done of Northland, but it's called S-mapping, and it's already getting it down to a more detailed kind of response. So if they pick up some of that work, but of course, yeah, they're going to have to go through that process. It's going to cost a lot of money, and yeah, ideally that's where our maps will inform their maps, and they won't have the cost of, you know, looking at Kaipara twice, if that makes sense. So
NRC won't,
yeah,
but I just heard that our mapping was going to be done before their mapping, but they're responsible for doing the mapping, so
yeah. So
are we doing it before them?
So we're not doing any. We're just using the Kaipara Kai report. So the Kaipara Kai work that was done a few years ago looked at all of our areas of highly productive soils and mapped it, and that's what we've used to inform our district plan zoning maps now. So if regional council pick up either our zoning maps, and we'll be explaining our methodology, because there was a methodology in how we did that, because it's not easy just fixing a blob to cadastre boundaries for properties. So we're going to explain our methodology to them, and then hopefully they will adopt what we've done with the Kaipara Kai work.
Except that in the meantime, we're required to comply with the 1974
That's right.
maps of the LUC.
Yep. That's because of the NPS is driving that. So that's the transition definition of highly productive land. Until such time as the regional council work is done, councils have to use that.
Through the chair, and to clarify, KDC is not spending money on mapping highly productive soil in advance of.
No, the work's already done.
Getting paid.
The work's already done, yeah.
Okay, that's cool. So we get a refund of Bullen? Yeah.
Councillor Manderson?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and my apologies if this is out of order, but you're speaking on the protection of productive land. Can I inquire what restrictions are there, if any, on where pine trees can be planted?
Pine trees. Well, at the moment, there's another national document. So the National Policy Statement for Plantation Forestry. So that looks after where pine trees can be established as a plantation forestry. I'm assuming you're meaning like big groups of pine trees for forestry activities. Yeah. So that national policy it's an NES, so a National Environmental Standard for Plantation Forestry is what governs those types of activities. So district plans don't typically double up on those rules. We leave that to the national document, and unless there's some effect that we need to manage, it might be a fire risk or something like that from the prime plantation, then we don't usually have any provisions in the district plan around that.
Aren't there fire risks with all forests?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
So you are involved in approving the planting of pine trees. There seems to be a mad rush to plant pine trees anywhere where people can. And I don't know of any restrictions. I ask of you, what restrictions are there?
Yep, so in the district plan, there's no specific restrictions unless there may be some rules in our operative district plan about planting them in a natural, high natural character landscape. And I believe we might have some proposed rules in the draft plan around that as well. And that's just because you don't want to be putting pine trees in a place of natural beauty. But other than that, there is not a lot that governs where these things go in our district plan because it's managed by a national document.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I believe that we have a major problem facing Northland here. We have nearly all of our pine trees dependent on export to China. China has, I believe, 65 million vacant premises or incompletely constructed or not even constructed at all. And we face a very real possibility that the collapse of sales to China is going to leave our forests where they are. Many would say that's a good thing because they just absorb carbon dioxide. Others would say, no, where's our income? We've got a situation where the government is subsidising the collection of carbon dioxide, but there's no income other than to those people involved. So these trees being planted where they like are actually destroying many rural communities. People don't want houses in amongst pine trees. The fire risk can just take you. So I think this is a major one for planners to be looking at. Yes.
Councillor Wilson Collins.
Thank you, the real mayor. He was trying to give me permission to talk. No, I just wanted to add to what you're saying there, councillor Mendelson, because the last term of council, that the pine trees were brought up several times, and we were asking staff for ways of mitigating those issues, because it's not just what you're discussing there, it's also the fact that corporations are planting pine trees to just leave there. And I don't know what our thoughts are in this council, but definitely last term there was a lot of discussion around what powers we actually have, which I believe weren't many, if any.
So I think,
no, it's just laughing. To be able to do something about it, because you're right, our rural communities are being stripped. Yeah.
Councillor, no.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question, because I was this Kaipara Kai thing. Would you be the right person to give some information? Because I actually spoke with the consultant before it started, because you got $1 million to get the consultation. And I looked at that 1974, whatever mapping they had. What's the total amount we spent on Kaipara Kai project? And are we still spending, as Councillor Jonathan mentioned, why we should spend on mapping when it's not our job? So I'll be very interested to see some financials on this project, if one of you or CE can provide.
Yeah, that's something for another time, I think, but yeah, certainly.
Thank you.
Okay, Catherine.
okay, well, very good to move on. I'll just talk a little bit about infrastructure, because I think this is certainly a bigger conversation for the zoning, the impacts of zoning, and but I did want to raise it just briefly here. So infrastructure is obviously a fairly significant constraint to the growth of Kaipara's towns and villages. If it's reticulated by, if it's not reticulated by the Three Waters services, and it does limit where we can provide these urban environments we've been talking about. It is an issue at the moment with our current applications for private plan changes, and it will probably continue to be an issue as we move forward with this proposed district plan as well. So I've just made a mention there that we need to be thinking about this and turning our mind to future capacity through the long-term plan and development contributions to solve some of those issues. It can't always just be addressed by the district plan. But it's obviously a significant thing in terms of where we can feasibly service our residential and commercial and industrial zones in particular. So any questions on that before I move off? Okay. Right, so back to the discussion on the MPS.
Okay, excuse me, Catherine, I'm sorry, I missed Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I ask why the council, specifically the planners, have not at least put a restriction on pine trees to, say, class 6 and 7 land? It would help many of those farmers retire. It's so unprofitable. They don't have buyers for the land now. They're not suitable for residential development, etc. They would get out. We could still have the carbon absorbed. It would just be absorbed on hills that had no higher value for anything else.
So we might be able to think about what we could do in the rural zone provisions, because it is a land use activity, planting pine trees. But I think lots of councils are in this space at the moment, particularly with the whole carbon farming issue. And we had hoped that the MPS revision that they were doing last year was going to give us councils more guidance. And the direction that we've kind of got is that it's more regional council look after anything that's affecting slopes and erosion and that type of thing. That's not our function as a council. So look, I really don't have an answer for you today, Councillor Anderson, other than we just keep it in our mind as we move through these workshops and talk about rural provisions and things, because it is a hard one to solve, because you'd have to identify where you want to put those restrictions on for forestry activities, and we have to be careful that we're not over-regulating over and above the national documents.
Councillor Lambert.
Yeah, the biggest distinction here, and I'm putting together a paper to present to us all, but it's not a forestry activity. It's a money-making venture. That's all it is, because a forestry is milling and that whole production process through. Carbon credit farming is just an absolute reap of the land. And I know it's a strong word, but I've checked it out, and they're raping the resources of the land and the neighbouring properties, and also our resources as a council, because we must look after wilding pines. We've got to look after fire control. It goes on and on. There are farmers who are living downstream who will have to close up their farming operation because they've lost their water, because these things take everything, and auditors are just sheer greed by that landowner or by overseas people. It's actually a massive cost to this council that we are going to inherit for decades and decades afterwards, and we need to do something really drastic about it. The fire provisions is just, but I'll put together something and present it on the problems that we're going to face in the near future. It is horrendous. And we've got to be quick, because the acreage that is getting planted out per week is absolutely atrocious. It's mind-boggling. But anyway, it's a bigger issue, but we've got to get away. It's not forestry what they're doing. It's actually not an agricultural process. They might as well be planting gold bars, because that's what there's no, it's
not production.
No, sorry, that's more of a statement, sorry.
So, hang on, I have to go in the order of people's hands. I see Councillor Paniora had her hand up for quite a while. Peter?
Yeah, through the chair, and I think this is just probably another statement as well. We're competing with central government and commercial incentives for this, but I think it's a outrageous suggestion that we can try and restrict landowners' use of their own land as a region, as a territorial authority. So I think that's getting into really risky territory. We need to be pushing back on central government, if anything, on trying to come to some sort of balance on, all the incentives and things that these people are getting. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Larson?
Oh, well, I don't just say too much. I mean, yeah, I think that the part of the conversation is pretty much what Pierre has just referred to, is that it is central government sanctioned and encouraged activity that's occurring. And how is that occurring? They are printing money and then giving it to the landowners or the forest owners, often offshore owners, to undertake the activity, and it's the best return that people can get off that land, and they're cashing out on this marginal land. And so we do have to provide people opportunities to use their land, and maybe we need to provide them with opportunities other than planting forestry.
Councillor Manderson?
We are shifting the ownership of many farms or much rural land to people offshore. And shifting that ownership offshore is we're shifting any input from these people to our community. The roads are existing primarily just for the extraction of these logs in the future. It's a major problem for the council. I don't wish to seriously restrict people's rights, but when it's for people that are offshore for pure financial gain, I think it's a serious consideration for council.
I agree. Anyone else? Councillor Howard?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just exactly on that and endorsing that. I think that we need to take forward a more assertive stance, I believe, in terms of looking at what Councillor Manderson has talked about, rather than just saying that, we could look at it, but I think make sure we're absolutely definite about this and be assertive, because it is critical and somewhere along the line needs to be part of our plans.
I could add that I've spoken to a number of people about this, and a common response is, what would I care when I've died? They've got no commitment to the area at all. They've got no involvement with the area at all, other than absorbing taxpayers' subsidy.
Okay, can we move on? Yep. Definitely, just to summate that, it's definitely an issue that concerns all of us in our council.
Yeah. And look, it could be that there's options outside of the district plan review as well that might be able to do something, as a council. So that conversation alive. Right, so back to the national policy statement for highly productive land. So this has some pretty significant implications for our district plan zoning, and to be quite honest, we didn't realise the extent of this until we started deep diving into the MPS HPL. So I've been doing some work in conjunction with a soils expert and getting some legal advice in terms of interpretation. And what elected members need to understand before we talk through zoning, and this will affect some of our areas that were identified in the draft district plan, is that we've got to apply this rigour of the policies in the MPS HPL. So any new urban zoning has to go through these policy steps. So I've just put them up on the screen. I won't read them out to you, but we do need to basically assess the areas and make sure that these are the areas, there's no other feasible alternatives, and we have to look at the cost of taking that highly productive land, if it is indeed highly productive land in the first place, before we can rezone. And the one that gets more trickier than that is actually in terms of the rural lifestyle zoning, because the MPS HPL has a very strong avoid objective and policy in the MPS, in clause 3.10 there. And what this means is there's only some exemptions that can be applied to land that is moving from rural zoning to rural lifestyle. So we have to be really sure as council that those areas can in fact be lost. We're doing some work at the moment looking at the draft areas to see whether they are in fact already largely compromised because of fragmentation that's already occurred. But any new areas that are on highly productive soils that are earmarked for rural lifestyle, we're going to have a really tough job justifying that. So I'm just signalling this now. It's not all doom and gloom, and we'll work you through what this means in terms of spatial aspects, because not all of the Kaipara is obviously highly productive soils. And we are dealing with only a couple of areas. But it is a bigger task than we thought back when we released the draft, to now get these areas from rural to what they deem urban environments. So urban environments includes everything that we've just talked about, all those zones for residential, commercial, industrial, open space zones. And then of course, as I mentioned, rural lifestyle as well.
So Catherine, through the chair, do we know the percentage of our district that's identified as class 1, 2
Yes,
soil supply?
I do have that in the practice note that I've just done. I could find that in my lunch hour because I don't remember them off the top of my head. Sorry, Michael.
Context.
Yeah, it's not a high percentage if I remember rightly. But yeah, and I can give you the breakdown of most of our district comprises, we don't have any LUC 1 soils, so it's mostly LUC 2 and 3 soils, because the MPS is looking at 1, 2 and 3. And most of the district is less than that. So it is just a small a small area, but there are some quite key areas around Mongawhai here. And of course, Ruai and Dargaville, not so much Mangatoroto or Kaiwaka, but it will implicate the work that we're doing in this space. So we'll talk through that a little bit more in detail. And Kyle's got some cool maps to show you guys later on that. But any questions on that?
Councillor Madison.
Through you, Mr Mayor, thank you. Looking at the constraints of zoning up there, that seems to me to be pretty much a nonsense, because the assumption of economic value of farmland versus the economic value of residential land rates the residential land so far ahead, it's no competition. Now, the planners are being used by vested interests in their interests, rather than in the arguments for or against free of commercial or personal activities. Yes, thank you.
Councillor Lambeth.
Yeah, through the mayor. I'm just going to use one little example from the race course to Dargaville, those straights along there. There's that I'm assuming that'll go in the highly productive land because it's that river silt loam sort of soil. However, that's all divided up into small lots with houses, and it's really not that productive. Some people have even got greenhouses on that land. But will those people be forced to rezone, or
No.
they'll be stopped from putting a garage on there, even though it's over a driveway that is non-productive? If it's already non-productive existing, would that stay that way?
Yeah, look, the document at the moment, like I mentioned, while we're in this transition zone, just relies on these land use capability maps. So if your property is caught as a 1, 2 or 3, then you have to apply the NPS. The ticket out is whether you're exempt in some way, and we've just been looking at who's exempt and who's not. And unfortunately, nobody's exempt until such time as we get these more accurate maps, supposedly from the regional council. We have to assess, and that's where you're going to have to jump through the hoops to show what's the activity that you're wanting to do, assess it by a soils expert or somebody that can say it's going to have no impact. But we are looking at areas because you'll know, like you mentioned, there are houses already built on highly productive soils, right? So they've already compromised the land in some shape or form. And there are a lot of activities. I'll just use an example of the industrial. There's some industrial activities already happening on rural land. It's compromised the soils already because no one's going to bowl that to use the soils, right? So if your assessment can show that actually the soils have already been compromised and there's no alternative, and this is a spot for this activity, that's the way you get through it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking of the scenario, say the storm damaged a greenhouse and it had to be rebuilt. A new permit was applied for to rebuild that.
Look, that would be fine because it's existing use, right? So unless you're going bigger and wider and that sort of stuff.
I just wanted to clarify that how sterile this was.
Yeah, it's more restrictive than we thought.
Yes.
That way, and it's unfortunate that it's gone. But the reason behind that is the government were adamant that they wanted to protect all highly productive land and it was going to cut councils off at the knees, basically. So fortunately, Kaipara, we've looked at every angle that we could to try and get some areas that were exempt. Because of the language of this document, we are caught. Yep. So it's a bit unfortunate.
Fine, thank you.
Councillor Larson.
Yeah, so just looking at that clause 10.3. And so I kind of see what you're saying, and they don't say that you can get out by having a small area that's already fragmented by subdivision to multiple owners.
Yep.
So if an owner of land such as that wants to use it and they have to come to demonstrate that to you, they can still use that as a reason why it's not productive. It's just not one of the things that happens to be listed there. So a lot of, in the example that I'm giving, a lot of the things listed under part 2 of 10.3 are actually irrelevant.
Yep. Oh, look, it's an interesting clause, that one. And it's going to be different in terms of whether you're using it for a resource consent subdivision or land use application versus a rezoning, because all our private plan changes need to go against this test now as well. So if you're rezoning land versus an individual subdivision application, it could be that you can put your house somewhere else, for example, but with rezoning, that's a bit more of a higher threshold, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have no class 1 land in the natural state, only tile drainage converts, and class 2 land is restricted very much by winter wetness, which is assumed to accelerate. That would mean, with what you suggested a moment ago, that we're only really talking about class 3 land, where it's perhaps a restriction on housing development, while there is a recognition that the farming is becoming so unprofitable that it would not compete favourably with housing. So why are we restricting it there? It may be the only class of land on which we could look at housing, and perhaps we should only separate out the very steep hill country, the unproductive farmland, as suitable for carbon dioxide absorption, if that's important. Yes, I think we've got to be very, very careful about it. We're imposing legalised theft on property rights. We're bringing them all under this control, arguably unnecessarily, and I'm just voicing a caution. Thank you.
Any further questions? Right, can we move on?
All right. I think we've probably covered, I was just going to cover off the rural zones and how they kind of work together, if elected members are interested in that. Then we've just got some direction that we were going to seek from elected members. So I think I've probably explained the 4 rural zones here when we were working through the list, but I've just got this slide here to sort of show the connectedness between the 4 rural zones, and obviously rural production is the one that relies on that Kaipaka'i mapping, and the general rural is predominantly everything else, but obviously still includes provision for primary production and other activities that require a rural location. And then we've got the rural lifestyle, which is smaller lots on the edges of urban settlement for rural residential, with some small scale rural production, and thinking about things like berry farms and small scale orchards, etc. And then I mentioned the settlement zone, and what I didn't say was that the settlement zone actually provides for a mixture of residential, commercial and light industrial and community activities. So it's a bit of a hybrid of all sorts of things, but it means that those smaller communities that don't have infrastructure can have some vibrancy and activities that happen within them. So there is a bit of potential to do a few things in there. And I've covered that off quite well, I think, just in terms of all of our discussions there. So I'm just going to jump ahead to the direction today. So we've obviously had a lot of feedback on the zones used in the draft district plan, which do generally support the direction we're heading in, but we wanted to just check in with elected members how you're feeling about the zones that we've put there, and whether you feel like they're suitable going forward with the proposed district plan, and any other issues or concerns, because today's advice to us will take that away and we'll continue our work on the zoning maps. So yeah, in your hands, Your Worship.
Councillor Larson.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, look, I actually want a bit more information, and what I've struggled with is being able to visualise how the zoning is actually set out across the whole district. Because when you go into the EMAP, individual properties, but you actually can't see the large scale mapping. And what I'm particularly interested in understanding is the proposed locations of residential, commercial and industrial zoning relative to what it is now. And the other thing I'd like to understand is I'm just looking at the rural zoning there in terms of your rural production zone and your general rural zone in context of the NPSHPL. What I'd like to know is what the total area of each of those two zones is and what the area of land that's classed as LUC 1, 2 and 3. I know there's no class 1 in those zones relative to that. Overall, I think we have quite a complex selection of zones in there, and I think things could be simpler, but I don't want to go any further than that. I think we've got a way to go in terms of having a closer look at it. Thank you.
Councillor Lambert?
Yeah, seeking direction, I'd like to see that general residential zone and what we are not electing to go to. I'd very much like to see that. You've got my views on the rural lifestyle zone and how that can be an economic solution for housing crisis, because there's virtually no infrastructure that we've got to worry about. The other thing which really scares me is the loss of property rights that rural landowners have by going to these new rural zones. A lot of them have purchased this land or have started their business operation on this land to expand it, and this changing of the rural zones will very much impede them a lot. It's not their fault. It's not their fault at all. They've committed a lot of expenditure into expanding businesses to make it a better community, a more thriving community, and all of a sudden we're going to come through and we're going to chop them off at their knees, and with this the change of the rural zone. The main point behind that is our current rural zone is very liberal as far as industrial and commercial activities go, which is going to be taken away from them.
To the Chair, so one point of clarification and one question. So we're not talking right now about subdivision density and the rules within zones. We're just seeking clarification on the suite of zones that we're proposing. And Councillor Lambert, is your view one single general residential zone, or would you like the 3 current residential zones and a general residential zone, so 4 residential zones? What's your preference, please?
I'd like to explore the view of having a look at that general residential zone
on top of the current 3.
If we're allowed to. I'm not sure whether we're only allowed, what we've got 16 out of 25. Are we allowed 17? Or is our basket only allowed to be so big when we're picking these?
It's entirely at your discretion.
Okay, right, yeah. Okay.
Councillor
Through the Mayor, it's just a miss out because I'm short on this side. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now, these spatial plans, I just want to see, is there another presentation for development?
Yes.
Because
next month, Councillor.
All right, so would be on similar lines. Okay. Thank you.
All right. I think sorry, Councillor Watson.
Thanks. I'm not sold on the general residential zone, and I think we might need some more information about what the effects of that would be.
Yes.
Because we have received a lot of information about these 3 zones and not so much about the general. So that would be really handy to get. I've clicked a button now and now I don't know where my other, because I was looking at the map, no. Somehow I just don't think, you've got the skill set I'm looking for. In regards to the zonings themselves though, like it seems like a lot, but I think that there's been a lot of work done behind the scenes to get us to this point that started even before I was on council, with the spatial planning. And I think that we've landed in a really good place. That's my feedback, but I would like some more information about the general residential and how.
I think councillor Larson's point about being more clarity about what we can see on the maps and where they trap these areas is not clear.
Through the chair, that's part of our closed workshop this afternoon.
Right.
Driving.
Is that not what they're talking about?
All right, so there'll be more firming up of ideas and feedback
Detail this afternoon.
this afternoon. Okay, we reached lunch point, have we? Okay. Any further questions? I won't close things without asking. All right, then we'll have half an hour for lunch. What's the time now? Okay, so that'll be just after 1. Okay.
I was just gonna, mission to conference.